After finishing Monster Hunter Stories 3, my overall take is pretty simple. This is a direct improvement over Stories 2. Almost everything that previous game attempted, Stories 3 does better. And the biggest improvement by far is the story. For the first time in the series, narrative feels like something you actually want to pay attention to. Something pretty important for a game with the word stories in the title. The cutscenes are worth watching, dialogue feels intentional, and character development has real value. But Stories 3 also takes a slightly different structural approach compared to what many RPG players might expect, particularly when it comes to Endgame. There isn't really a traditional postgame. Instead, the Endgame is baked directly into the final stretch of the story itself. And that design choice explains a lot, including the game's potentially jarring late game difficulty spike. My name is Zenny, please join me as I give you my full, honest thoughts now I have completed Monster Hunter Stories 3. If you've played Stories 2, almost everything you know mechanically is here, but much more refined. The biggest improvement for me is the separation between skill usage and your kinship gauge. In Stories 2, using skills consumed the very same resource needed to build up your ultimate attack. Now what that encouraged was a fairly repetitive loop consisting of spamming double attacks to build up your kinship gauge, unleashing your ultimate, and repeating the process. But in Stories 3, those two resources are separated into stamina and kinship. This one single change adds significantly more strategic depth. Skills now carry real value. You're encouraged to actively use them rather than hoard the resource in the background. And because ultimates are no longer competing with your core set, they feel more impactful when you do pull one off. By the time you get to the late game, you can optimize your monsters to make ultimates more frequent, but it never becomes anything that felt game breaking, at least for me. The system instead just rewards thoughtful builds. More broadly speaking on this, the combat remains pretty damn fluid and well designed. Customization of monsters via genes is very robust. The team you put together feels just as meaningful as it is fun with the variety available. And weapons support multiple different playstyles, especially when you experiment with different decorations. However, one thing that is worth noting for you as a consumer, everything you experience in the demo version of this game is a very accurate representation of the full game itself. There is additional depth later on, but there isn't any drastic mechanical evolutions during the playthrough. The systems you learn early on are the systems you will use for the entire journey. That's not inherently a flaw because the systems are strong, but it does mean some of you may feel a degree of repetition. Let's talk about progression and pacing next. For the majority of the game, the difficulty curve is handled very well. If you were to follow the main story at a natural pace, capturing monsters you like, completing a few side quests here and there, the progression will feel very smooth and fair. You might need to grind on occasion, but it's never anything intrusive to that extent. And importantly, challenge is pretty optional for a lot of the experience. If you want to go test yourself, there are monsters you can fight early on that will absolutely destroy you. But the player also has the choice to walk away and come back later. The game doesn't force you into frustration. Those who want a tough fight can go get it. Those who don't can just keep progressing the story. And that holds very true until the very final portions of the game. Without going into spoilers, the last stretch of the game introduces multiple back-to-back bosses that are significantly more difficult than anything you faced up to that point. The jump is sincerely very noticeable. And while strategy can play a major part in the encounters, a lot of these fights do also feel like stat checks. During my own personal playthrough, I changed my gear, I would adjust builds, rethink strategy, and it did make some difference, but not nearly as much difference as simply grinding a few levels and trying again. Straight up taking an hour to grind out a few levels and coming back to the fight drastically reduced the difficulty. But this loops us back into something I mentioned earlier on. Challenging fights towards the end of the game is something I am absolutely happy for, but what does make it feel slightly jarring is that there isn't any new content to grind out at that point. What I mean by that is you're revisiting the already unlocked areas and fighting monsters you've already fought to get that XP. It can almost create a bit of confusion. I felt that maybe I was missing something, when in reality, the solution was just to go level up. Something I hadn't felt for 90% of the game. But here is where the design philosophy becomes greatly important. Once you defeat the final boss, that's it. There isn't any harder post-game dungeons or areas, there isn't a new tier of content that surpasses what you've already done. The climax of the story is intentionally the hardest thing in the game. In that sense, the final acts of the story is the end game. And while this design makes sense structurally, it might catch some players off guard, especially those who expect the difficulty spike to come after the credits, not before them. For those of you that have completed Stories 2, imagine the Fatalis fight happened before you rolled story credits. That's kind of what is happening here. So if you dislike grinding, you're going to feel that friction. But then again, most JRPG fans will be used to it, and I'm sure it's a non-issue. Right, without spoilers, let's chat a bit about the story, because this is where the game shines. One of my biggest criticisms of Story 2 was its narrative, and that has been completely fixed here. The story carries weight. There are genuine mysteries, meaningful reveals, and big emotional moments. And it does all of that while retaining the classic Monster Hunter charm and sense of adventure. The tone kind of balances some light-hearted exploration with more high-stake developments as you keep progressing forward. And by the time you reach that final act, again without spoiling anything, it genuinely feels like a culmination of everything up to that point. The quality of cutscenes is high, dialogue is generally pretty well written, and character development is not only interesting on its own, but also provides real gameplay impact too. If I did have a criticism of the story, and this is something I mentioned in my preview video, it would be that the pacing, or rather the delivery of cutscenes and dialogue, can feel a bit forceful at times. There are moments where you enter an area, trigger a cutscene, walk forward a couple steps, immediately trigger another. It feels a bit stop and start. And if you're like me and you're excited to just go explore this brand new area you've unlocked, constantly being interrupted by this dialogue before getting to jump into the world, at times felt a bit much. But once again, if you're playing a game with stories in the title, you should probably already be expecting some heavy narrative focuses, and luckily because the story is good, it all justifies itself. Moving on, I mentioned this earlier, but Stories 3 does not have a traditional post-game. The developers openly stated in an interview that they wanted players to feel satisfied when you finish the main story, and that philosophy is pretty damn clear in the way the game's executed. Before you roll credits, you will have unlocked everything. All available monsters, every single quest, whether it be a side story or optional, all the various upgrades for your equipment, and more or less the ability to 100% the game. There is no additional story chapter after you roll credits. There's no secret final boss, no additional level of difficulty tier. When you beat the game, you have beaten it. But it's very important to know this. That doesn't mean there's a lack of content. In fact, it's the complete opposite. By the time I finished the story, I still had an uncountable amount of quests available on the map, so much equipment left to upgrade, and monsters that I straight up haven't even discovered yet. If you choose to play through this game as a completionist, you can easily spend up to 100 hours in this game, no doubt about it. But in terms of replayability, that's going to depend on how much you enjoy the story. Given just how narrative heavy the experience can be, as we just discussed, Stories 3 doesn't feel like a game designed for an immediate second playthrough. Instead, it feels designed as a complete, contained experience wrapped up in a nice package. By the time you've went from start to finish, you're happy enough to put it down. Monster Hunter Stories 3 is almost in every way an improvement over Stories 2. Combat is deeper and more strategic, systems feel refined, build variety is meaningful, the story is stronger, and when you reach the end, you genuinely feel like you have completed something substantial. However, the late game difficulty spike is real. It's sharp, it's noticeable, and it will surprise some players. Grinding a few levels makes a significant difference, but players who expect the same smooth curve from the start of the game may begin to feel frustrated in the final stretch. If you enjoyed the demo version of this, you will almost certainly enjoy the full game, because again, the demo is a very accurate representation of the overall experience. If you were unsure how you feel after playing the demo, I would approach this game cautiously. The core gameplay loop and fundamentals don't dramatically change beyond the demo content. Overall, this is a really strong JRPG and it's a great step forward for the series. Just prepare yourself for the final fights in this game. If you have any questions on whatever I've discussed today, please feel free to leave a comment down below. Even though the game launches in a couple days, I am still limited as to what I can and can't answer, so please bear that in mind. Thanks for watching.